So welcome back to the AI Founders Masterclass. For those of you joining, we are now in our third week. And so we're excited. This week we have Daphne Koller, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But before we get in, just a little bit of housekeeping. So those of you who've been here before, you know this is a community. Just a reminder, these are our community guidelines. Please make sure you review them. We reserve the right to remove anybody from the conversation or from our Slack community if you do not follow them. So please review these on your own time. A reminder that this is not it. This is our third week. Our fourth week and final week is next week, and we have Jan Stojka joining us. You don't want to miss that conversation. That'll be next Wednesday. Information will be in the Slack channel. And then beyond that, we also have a really exciting this week, coming up this week, because we have more practical sessions. So we have a really great opportunity tomorrow to start working through some brand as well as talent. So this is an opportunity to work with some of what we call our velocity team. These are experts on the Radical Ventures team who usually work with our portfolio companies. They're coming in to give a bit of advice to folks, usually information that they give our founders to you, and you'll have a chance to ask some questions and do some workshopping with them. So that is tomorrow. And then on our Thursday session, we're going to have a bonus practical session where we're going to go through some go-to-market strategy as well as some finance strategy. So getting a lot of those finance questions, the nitty-gritty, we'll be here to answer it all from basics to more complex questions. And then finally, next week, after Jan, we're going to have another practical session that's going to be a pitch practice. So if you have a pitch, we're going to be doing some quick 1-minute pitches and getting feedback from your team. So really excited to have that, and that's upcoming, so make sure that you don't miss out. And then finally, just another reminder, our hackathon is going to start on the 30th. Find your team and sign up. The lab is open. If you have questions, let me know, or Roy from the Cohere team. If you get that gold prize, you're going to be able to have a conversation with the CEO and co-founder of Cohere, Aiden Gomez, and also 3,500 Cohere credits and 1,500 Canadian in cash. So really looking forward to that. And really looking forward to our conversation today. So a little bit about that. Siobhan Zillis, who was originally scheduled to lead today's discussion, has come down with a really bad cold. We hope she feels better soon. But stepping in, we do have Radical's managing partner, Jordan Jacobs. You might recognize him from our first conversation with Fei Li and Geoffrey Hinton. He is the managing partner and co-founder of Radical Ventures. He also co-founded Layer 6 AI and was co-CEO prior to his acquisition by TD Bank Group. He's also the director of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research and the founder of the Vector Institute. And the Vector Institute, for those of you who are not familiar, is a concept he devised with Tomi and Geoffrey Hinton himself. So Jordan, welcome back to the AI Founders Masterclass. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Well, we'd like to introduce Daphne Koller. Daphne has had an incredible career. Or multiple careers. So I can walk through a bit of that. She is the founder and CEO of Insitro, a machine learning drug discovery company, which I will be happy to talk about through the course of this conversation. She's also the co-founder and was co-CEO of Coursera, which many of you know. She's had a long distinguished career as a Stanford University professor before going out and starting Coursera, and remains an adjunct professor at Stanford. She, in 2023, was elected to the National Academy of Science and has a list of accomplishments and awards that are, I could take the entire time reading out to you. So we'll skip it, but safe to say we have an incredible guest. Daphne, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jordan. It's a pleasure to be here.
So our audience today is mostly young AI researchers, people in university in many cases who are considering going out and starting their careers as entrepreneurs. You've had this incredible transition from academic to entrepreneur. Can we go back to the moment when you decided to make that transition from Stanford professor and go out and start Coursera? Why did you do it? What was the challenge, kind of the most challenging aspect of that transition? And what motivated you to make the shift?
So in some ways, I would say this goes back to 2004, which is a fairly long ways back. And in 2004, I got the MacArthur Award, which is something that is a kind of unusual award because it's not one that is primarily focused on academics. It's one that any adult in the United States is eligible to receive. And there were 250 million people living in the US at the time, and adults, and I was like, why me? I mean, 25 people get this in every year. What made my accomplishments stand out? And I look back and, you know, I'd done some influential work in machine learning and so on, but I couldn't point to something that I was like, this is the thing that makes me worthy to get this award. And so I started to look for it. And in my academic work, I started to focus more and more on biology. I'm sure we'll come back to that later. Wrote what is even today remains a very influential paper in machine learning for cancer histopathology, and how it can, even at the time, this is back in 2009, helpful to make better diagnoses than people could, pathologists could, even with the technology at the time. Of course, now today it's not even a comparison anymore. And was not able to make like an actual tangible impact with that, because discovered that companies were very loath to take papers as the technology transfer vehicle. They wanted products, and there's zero incentive for academics to build products. And so I was getting increasingly frustrated at my lack of ability to make a tangible, meaningful difference in the lives of people. And so when Coursera kind of emerged almost by accident from this project that I'd been leading at Stanford on technology-assisted education, and we realized that, hey, we didn't just have to teach Stanford students, we could teach all sorts of students with the scaling of technology. And all of a sudden, this amazing phenomenon happened that we had 100,000 students in each one of the courses that we put out. It was like, boy, this is real impact, like real impact, immediate impact. And I can't just let it go by and go back and write some more papers. I needed to make it come to life. And so I took what was supposed to be a 2-year leave of absence with this wonderful safety net of going back to Stanford 2 years later. Everything was structured around that. My vesting schedule had like a 2-year kind of thing, and then a long tail based on 1 day a week of, you know, future kind of lightweight engagement. And when 2 years came to an end, I was like, I can't go back right now. This is still too new, too fragile. It needs more of my investment. And Stanford has a very hard line policy on, you know, leave of absences and how long they can last. And they said, you need to choose. And I did. And my mother thought I was nuts, because who on earth resigns an endowed chair at Stanford? But anyway, there I am, and ended up kind of sticking with the industry route and never went back.
And it worked out okay. Presumably your mother was happy in the end.
You know, I think she eventually got accustomed to it, is all I would say. But they had always viewed my academic career as like a incredibly aspirational goal, and it was obviously, I think, quite successful. And yeah, I think she eventually came around, I would say.
Okay, that's good. I think some of us have similar experiences with mothers wishing we went the academic route when we decided to be entrepreneurs. But did you, in making that shift, you said that it was very hard to build a product, or there was no real motivation to build a product as an academic. Was that really the motivation? You felt like you could solve problems at a much bigger scale, touch more people by going out and building a company?
I think it was partly that. So first of all, there is the resourcing. Yes, you have, you know, in the university, a large grant is like a, you know, $1 million grant spread across 3 labs. It's like tiny in the scheme of things of what you can do in industry. But that, I think, is less important than the alignment of incentives. Your goal is clearly to build something that people will actually benefit from. And the other, I think, is the fact that you have a group of people, all of whom are actually, at least if you build things right, rowing in the same direction. Whereas in university, there's a reason they call it herding cats. You know, the incentive structure is, as an academic, even across labs, but even within a lab, is for each person to go their own way, because that's how they make a name for themselves. You know, the whole name, principal investigator, suggests I have my own pyramid and I am at the top of that pyramid, right? And in industry, it's a clear team sport and everybody rowing in the same direction. So I think that, as much as the financial resourcing, is the critical thing to truly making a big impact on, you know, lives of real people.
And how much did that shift? How aware were you of that shift when you made it? That this is now, instead of being, you know, an individual led pursuit, it's a team pursuit. And what were the kind of positives and negatives of that transition?
I don't know that I fully appreciated that part of it until later. I think that was more of a growing realization. I did realize the part about the lack of incentives within academia to build a product, because why would you, as a grad student, I mean, I had been a grad student, right? Your goal is to do the minimum amount of work that would allow you to get figure 6 of your paper done, and then you put the code out on GitHub because you kind of have to these days, but it's not intended for anyone to actually use it. It's intended largely to check the box, right? And so it's very difficult, because it's not it's very hard to incentivize a grad student, especially when working on their own without having like a real product team around them and no one who's trained to build a product, to spend the quite significant effort that it would take to build something of durable value versus just enough to get the figures in your paper done.
And okay, so the first business is not right in your academic wheelhouse.
No.
At all. You did come back around to that with Insitro, but we'll come back to that. When you're making the decision to go out and build Coursera, was there, in addition to seeing that the technology that you were working on academically could actually be used at a broader scale, did you identify was there a problem that you said, we can solve this either better or differently than anybody else?
Well, kind of. Coursera was a bit of an unusual beast in that the product vision had actually been kind of, at least from like the usage perspective, had been established as part of the academic origins. We had no clue, by the way, on how we would monetize. Literally, you can go to the university partnership agreements that we were signing back then. They have been released via the FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, so it's in the public domain. And you can see that there is an appendix at the end of the agreement that says, eventually we might make money. Here's 12 ideas on how we might make money. We have no idea which of those we would pursue, but if you think we might make money, this is how we would go about this. None of us had a clue. I think the product experience, the videotaped courses chunked into more manageable units, the interaction with the course content via these interactive quizzes, the automated grading, the student-to-student interaction via the forums, that had already been part of the vision, even when I was still thinking about this at Stanford as a purely internal Stanford project. I have a slide deck that I shared with President John Hennessy at the back in 2010, I think, that had all of those elements in it. What we didn't think about was, okay, let's offer it to we talked about maybe at some point we'll offer it to the world, but then that kind of happened faster than we expected. And it's like, okay, there is a real demand for this. And I will tell you that our investors, when we first presented this, they knew we had no clue how to monetize. And I think the premise was that something with this much excitement and demand around it, we'll figure out the monetization over time.
So there are many different approaches to starting a company. That's in a lot of ways the best way to do it, is to find that you have customers before you even realize that you have a business.
Yep.
And you'll grow that and expand on it and take it in the direction that your customers want, and then ultimately charge or make money from it in a way that makes sense for the way the business is evolving. So that is, I would say, in the world of AI, one way to do it. Another, obviously, is people are working on something in their academic lives or have an intuition about something, but they have to build something first to put it out there. You had the benefit of having built it inside the platform of Stanford, and it working at a smaller scale. When you made the decision to move from Coursera, or maybe take us through the thinking about going from Coursera to the beginning of Insitro, because it is a total shift in focus area, but it's back to your original area of focus academically. Can you just explain to us how you thought about it, the time frame, the way you approached it?
Sure. So, after the decision not to go back to Stanford, that happened in early 2014, I was there at Coursera. And if you look at the timeline, I think the timeline is really important. I left Stanford at the end of 2011. The machine learning revolution, as you will have heard from your conversation with Jeff Hinton and my friend Fei Li, started in 2012. And so I missed the beginning. And honestly, when I say missed the beginning, the first few years of Coursera were just such a unbelievable whirlwind. I mean, we were in the newspapers like, I don't know, between 7 and 20 times every single week. I was flying around the world, meeting everything from African heads of state to Russian oligarchs. And it was kind of like a fairly freakish existence. When people asked me at the time, how is it to be at Coursera, I said that it's kind of like being the main character from the movie Being John Malkovich, which is like, this is not my life. I don't know whose life it is. It's kind of interesting, but it's not my life. So it was a very weird experience. And so, so after the first few years have kind of gone by and things became a little bit saner, I started to realize that Coursera was an incredible mission, still is, but it doesn't really have a deep technology stack. I mean, this was, I think, before the days today, I would say, yeah, of course, we can build AI into everything. But back at the time, that really wasn't feasible, not least of which because there wasn't nearly enough training data to do anything interesting. And there certainly wasn't any science. And I'd always been guided in my actions, well, not always, but as I became more and more interested in impact, by the North Star of where will I make the biggest difference? And will I make the biggest difference by continuing to be at Coursera, going around, acquiring more content and so on and so forth, or could someone else do it just as well, maybe even better? Versus really, now that I'd kind of started to look around and realized that the machine learning revolution was transforming the world around us, but it really wasn't having much of an impact in the life sciences, and recognizing I was one of the very few individuals who'd actually had a deep grounding in both. And those people are very rare because each of the disciplines is very deep and very broad, biology and computer science / machine learning, and they are very different in the way in which they approach problems, they approach the world. And so they actually kind of, in some ways, are kind of like magnets that repel each other. And so there's not a lot of people that can do both. And I felt like I had an opportunity to make a really big difference to human health in a way that was disproportionately large. That is the bang for the buck, if you will, versus someone else coming in and trying to do the same thing was very, very high because there's just not a lot of people who could do that. And so that made me realize that the biggest impact I could make was actually by leaving Coursera and in leaving it in good hands and going off and trying to build a company that probably no one else could really build.
I think that's a really important point to make to people who are considering being an entrepreneur, that leveraging your distinct experience, advantage, relationships, whatever it is that makes you uniquely able to do something that very few or no one else can do is, we always tell founders, that's what you should lean into.
100%. And, when I left Coursera, I was thinking about, well, okay, so what are my unique skills? And I want to think about my unique skills and intersect that with benefit to the world, like making a big impact. I mean, something I'm super passionate about is the environment. I think a lot of us are these days, but I wish I could make an impact to the environment. I don't know anything about environmental science other than what I read in the newspapers and occasional papers and such. And so is that really the place for me to make the biggest impact? Or do I go and make the biggest impact on something where I do have a disproportionate advantage, not from a competitive advantages perspective, but from like an impact advantage, if you will?
And so take us through the timeline there. So you're kind of thinking about it and the opportunity. Was from the beginning the idea that you're going to combine machine learning and your background in biology and the ability to maybe do drug discovery? Like, was drug discovery the specific place you wanted to focus, or was it somewhere else? Did you consider different opportunities?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And honestly, I didn't, thinking back again on that timeline, I had left academia in late 2011. Now we're talking about late 2016. Basically 5 years of being out of science and not having really had an opportunity to follow all the developments and advancements that had happened. And so I didn't know what I wanted to do. And there's a lot of luck in life, a lot of happenstance. I reached out to Art Levinson, who is obviously an incredible leader. He had been the CEO that had led Genentech to glory, and had been on the board of Apple, on the board of Google, and was leading a company called Calico that was doing drug discovery within the Alphabet umbrella. And I reached out to him. He and I had interacted before. I'd actually sat on the thesis committee of his son Jesse, and I met him at a dinner sometime. And so I reached out to Art mostly to just ask him, as someone who'd been both on the biotech side and the tech side, what could someone like me do? Where could I contribute the most? And he was, let's just say, unashamedly self-interested, and said, you should come to Calico. And I didn't know a lot about what Calico did. They weren't at the time very much out there in terms of publicity. Even today, they're kind of still a little bit more kind of holding back, which I actually appreciate. And so but the opportunity to work with someone like Art and learn from him was something that I felt was hard to pass up. And so I did that. And, I did learn a tremendous amount. Certainly I learned a lot about drug discovery there, because I'd known nothing about that. I did a lot of biology while I was at Stanford, but not any drug discovery. And so I learned a tremendous amount, but realized also relatively quickly that what they were doing and what I wanted to do were two quite different things. They're focused on unraveling the biology of aging, which I understand and I appreciate is a very important goal, but it's a goal for a biologist. And I am still at heart a computational person, and I wanted to build a platform that makes it easier to discover and develop medicines, partly because when I went to Calico and saw the traditional way of doing this, I was like, really, that's how you do things? That's like, there's so many places one could improve on this approach. I mean, not specifically to Calico, I think this is the industry as a whole. And so anyway, I saw that as a huge opportunity to make a big difference.
So you identified the problem. What was the kind of timeline from when you started having those thoughts to going out and actually launching Insitro?
So probably not more than a few months. So at the end of 2017, I think someone had told a few investors that I was maybe a little bit thinking about my next steps, which was quite recent. And they approached me and said that they had decided as a syndicate to make an investment in a kind of a company that did machine learning for drug discovery. They had done diligence on a whole bunch of potential companies in this space and not been able to gain conviction around any of them. But they felt like I had credibility, and so maybe they could build a company around me. And I was like, okay, cool. And so ended up with $100 million Series A as an N of 1, which is kind of an interesting place to be. I mean, I know one can legitimately say it's a good problem to have, fair enough, but it's still kind of a hard slog to build a company that warrants that level of investment, especially in an industry where, frankly, I had no network. I mean, if this had been a pure machine learning company, sure, I could have drawn on lots of people that I'd worked with, but machine learning for drug discovery, I didn't know anybody in the drug discovery world, not really. And so it was a fairly interesting kind of exercise on how to figure out the space quickly enough to build a company.
So I remember when it was announced that you raised that, and it was at that time, I mean, this is pre-LLM world where it seems everyone gets 9-figure checks left and right, but at that time it was a shockingly large amount of money for a Series A, an incredible fundraise. Which I think speaks to people's confidence in you. But the approach you were taking, there were very few companies at that point that were doing this, basically combining machine learning for drug discovery, which is reflected, frankly, in the name of the company, right? Which maybe you want to just describe to people that I think it's a brilliant. We talk with founders about this all the time. If you can coin a term that is descriptive but not generically descriptive, and simple, and you can write it the way that you pronounce it, that's the kind of the holy grail. You managed to do that. You want to just describe to people what the name comes from?
And I can tell you a funny story that I don't often tell, which is kind of a cute little kind of meant to be type story. So Insitro is, which is spelled INSITRO, is the synthesis of in silico, which means in the computer, silicone, and in vitro, which means in the test tube, in the lab. Those are the Latin terms, and they are very commonly used in our space. And so this is the synthesis. And the reason why it's so evocative of the name of the company is that because we're truly bringing together in the seamless integration, wet lab scientists and computational scientists. We print a lot of our data in our lab via automation and robots that pipette cells and differentiate cells and image cells and all sorts of things like that. And then, of course, a lot of computational stuff that's both interleaved and then layered on top. And so that synthesis is like the core of who we are. It's the core of our culture. It's the core of how we operate. And so I came up with that name. And now comes the funny story. So obviously, having come from Coursera, where we spent months hunting for a domain name and all sorts of funky names, by the way, most of them worse than Coursera, that ended up being squatted on by some random person and who asked us for whatever $1 million for the domain name and such. I was like, the first thing I need to do is secure the domain name. And so I went online and discovered that sure enough, someone was squatting on that domain name. And when I said that to my hypothetical investors at the time, my would-be investors, they said, this is such a great name that we're willing to pay a lot of money for this domain name. But I was still at Calico at the time, and I didn't want to start transacting while I was, still employed by another company. And so admittedly, I was tapering off, but I didn't want to go and start doing weird transactions while being employed by somebody else. So I said, well, so I'm going to finish out my last couple of weeks, and then we'll go and we'll transact for the domain name. And anyway, so the last day is Friday. Saturday, I take the day off. On Sunday, I'm like, okay, I need to go find a lawyer who will negotiate on that domain name. And it turned out the squatter disappeared, and I got it for $9.99.
Literally in the time that you decided between picking the name and leaving, the domain expired. They're right. Incredible.
It's karma. It's meant to be. So
amazing. Well, I mean, anyone who's watching this, if you can come up with a name that is original, but in itself describes the entire company, so your entire deck can just be the name, I don't think you can do any better than that. So well done. And to get it for $10, even better. So amazing choice of name, very inspirational, I think, for everyone who's thinking about starting something. Okay, so you raise a lot of money, Series A, and start building out this company, which has gone on to raise much, much more money subsequently from all kinds of investors, including our friends at Canada Pension Plan, who led, I think, the C round, I want to say.
And they're amazing. We're so privileged to have them in our cap table.
We've been really very happy with them, as they were our anchor LP, so they've been terrific to us as well. Okay, so you go and you build out this company. Just tell us a little bit about the areas that you've been focusing on, because I think the disease areas that you're focused on are fascinating.
So let me actually start with the technology stack, because I think it drives the selection of disease areas, because in some ways, as we think about how we build a company, and by the way, the tagline, if you will, for our vision as a company is pipeline through platform. Pipeline, for those of you who are not in the biotech space, is the set of medicines that you're hoping to advance. And pipeline through platform means that for us, the pipeline needs to come off of the platform that we're building. And if you might think, as most of you, I expect, are computational people, that this is something goes without saying, it does not. The number of companies that have actually built a pipeline through a platform approach that generates new medicines is, you can count them on the fingers of one hand and probably have a finger or two left over. So it's a very unusual build. So the platform that we have is, you mentioned earlier, Jordan, the fact that there weren't a lot of machine learning and drug discovery companies at the time that we started. There's a heck of a lot more now, but we're still quite differentiated, because the vast majority of companies in this space work in the area of, once you have a biological target that you have conviction around, they will turn it into a drug with certain drug-like properties. The molecule that they generate, that they're looking to kind of accelerate the process, make fewer bad compounds along the way. So it's an acceleration thing. And I'm not dismissing in any way the value of that exercise. But the truth is that the biggest problem, to my mind, in drug discovery is that we simply go after the wrong targets. Most drugs fail. The big costs in drug discovery are because the vast majority of things that start clinical development fail. There's a 90% failure rate. That's not a 90% success, that's 90% failure rate. And that's most of the time because the biology is complicated and we don't understand it. And so while I think there's a lot of value in accelerating the process of going from a target that you have conviction around to a drug, getting to the right target, I think, is where the real value creation happens. It's earlier in the pipeline. It's kind of where do you aim the weapon versus making the bullet go faster. But I think it's really critical. And so we've built a biology discovery platform that combines very high content, unbiased measurements of cells that have or do not have disease genetics, so that we can understand how disease genetics influence what the cells do, how they operate, what they look like, and so on. And the same thing on the people side. So we collect high content clinical data from people, MRI, histopathology, various types of blood measurements, and really ask, if you have disease carrying genetics, how does that influence those high content, they're called phenotypes, phenotypic traits. And the truth is that disease manifests in fairly high fidelity and fairly high resolution in these high content data modalities in ways that people just aren't able to perceive because the data are so rich and so complex. So the big use for us in machine learning is really understanding these phenotypic traits, phenotypes of cells, phenotypes of people, and how disease-causing processes make them go one direction versus another, and then what interventions can we do to move them back. So that's the fundamental platform that we've built, and it's machine learning at its core, in the sense that the fundamental engine for interpreting phenotypes is machine learning, but also we weave machine learning into everything that we do. So we couldn't even generate our cells at the same level of accuracy and predictability without having robots that use machine learning to, feed and passage cells. And so that's the fundamental platform that we've built. And that platform has unlocked value for us across multiple therapeutic areas. And honestly, the biggest problem that we have, not that it's a problem, I mean, it's a good problem, is that the platform is so broadly deployable that we kind of have to pick. And it's like, oh, we could also use it there. No, we can't. We need to focus. So the therapeutic areas that we're currently in, which is still pretty broad, is we are in neuroscience, where the primary use of the platform is actually in cellular systems, because brain primary data is kind of hard to get. People don't appreciate it when you take biopsies of their brain, so it's not easy to get data from brains. So we mostly generate neurons from stem cells and differentiate them into neurons and see how, let's say the genetics of ALS might cause these neurons to behave differently. And in fact, they do, interestingly enough, even though they're very young neurons, and ALS is a neurodegenerative disease. We are in metabolic disease, specifically in the what's called metabesity these days, the metabolic disease that is derived from obesity and so on, and all of the consequences of that. And then we are more recently in oncology, where the primary use case is actually from clinical data, because what we found is that the cellular models that are used in oncology are very what's called reductionist. They're very simplified systems that don't really capture that interplay between the tumor and the immune system, the tumor and the stroma that surrounds it. And what we found is that there's a tremendous amount of information that is available in the biopsy images that are taken from every solid tumor patient. And every pathologist looks at, hundreds of these in a day. There's just an unbelievable amount of information that is left on the table that provides novel, actionable targets. And so same technology stack, same imaging algorithms, same self-supervised learning for embeddings. It's kind of interesting how that same technology stack can be used in such different applications.
And so it really is, a complete game change in the way that drug discovery happens, because you're able to use that same stack. You don't have to go rebuild it for each different target that you're aiming at. How do you, and you talk about focus though. how do you make the decision of what to go after? So you want to focus on ALS, you want to focus on particular cancer. You could do so many different things. Is it intuition? Is it, trying different things and seeing if they're starting to work? How do you make the decision of where to focus?
It's a great question. It's one that we think about a lot. I think there's elements of the extent to which the disease actually lends itself to the capabilities of our platform. So I'll give you an example. In the context of ALS, we're deploying the cellular platform that we have, and that's because that particular disease has what's called high penetrance, which means with very significant causal effect, disease-causing mutations. And so if we engineer one of those mutations into a cell, there's a reasonable expectation that that cell will manifest a phenotype that is caused by that disease-causing mutation. There are a lot of other diseases where, frankly, you're not going to see a huge phenotype because the signal is the complicated interplay. The disease is caused by a complicated interplay of multiple very small effect size variants that kind of come together. It's very subtle. It requires maybe multiple environmental insults, like a lifelong McDonald's diet kind of thing. And so you can't really replicate that in an in vitro system. And so the fit between the platform and the disease is a big piece. And because we have two platforms, the cellular and the clinical, we actually can bring those two together. And so we have more opportunities, but still not everything fits one or the other. The other one, of course, is just, I guess there's maybe two more. One is the unmet need. There's diseases that have, reasonable number of good treatments. And, can we really come up with something that would be a game changer relative to the standard of care? Maybe not so much, or maybe at least you don't want to start with that as your premise. And then the third, I think, is just the feasibility of actually bringing this forward. And when we think about clinical development, there's some clinical development exercises that are way more tractable than others, partially because maybe the technology just hasn't gotten to that place. So I'll give you an example. One of the indications that is most advanced for us is an pediatric epilepsy. It's a genetic epilepsy. You have this variant, this mutation in your DNA, and it causes you to have huge refractory epilepsy with multiple seizures a day. Really sad babies. I mean, really sad. Well, the nice thing about that is that if you're actually able to make a difference, you can see that in a matter of weeks. You do not need a 5-year Alzheimer's trial to see that. And so that is, and you don't need 10,000 people. You could do it with, a much smaller trial, because the effect sizes, if they're there, which that's the premise, that's the hope, then it'll be quite significant. Other things are much more complex. And for example, I would love to be able to do something in neuropsychiatric disorders. The so-called clinical endpoints are so squishy, so subjective. You bring someone in and you say, how are you feeling today? Are you less depressed than you were feeling last time, 3 months ago? I mean, I don't remember. And yeah, maybe I'm less depressed because I had a better cup of coffee when I came in. It's just those squishy endpoints that are so subjective, so variable, are a nightmare to develop against. And so that's not the overriding factor, but it's certainly one that we think about.
Do you think that is why maybe there's been less effort at building, using some of the new computational methods to address psychiatric disorders? It's so much harder to measure success.
I think that's part of it. I think the other part is the lack of good preclinical models that allow you to actually test stuff. I mean, people will tell you that the animal models for whatever cancer are bad. That is true. The animal models for neuropsychiatric disorders are horrendous. I mean, how do you tell if a mouse is depressed? You have something that kind of looks like the mouse is less active. I mean, but is it really the same as depression? Is it the same underlying causal factors? Almost certainly not. And so how do you know that how can you get early evidence before you go into these massively expensive human clinical trials that your drug is doing something meaningful? So there's a lot of reasons why neuropsych is just really hard.
So, okay, to transition from that advice to, we want to open up to questions from the audience. For those who do want to post a question, please use the chat function in Zoom. Just
maybe
ping them
while
in.
we're waiting for that, I will just say, while this might sound very specific to, you know, you talk about animal models for neuropsychiatric disorder, what does it have to do with me as a founder in a computational company? Thinking about the tractability of your product, whatever it is that you choose to work on, all the way through, not just the, oh, I can build it, it's so easy, I can build this app, but can I find the target audience in the right place? Can I market it to them? I mean, all of those things, they have kind of parallels in other product lines. And the important thing is to think about how you pull all the way through, because being really successful in the first half and then hitting a wall when it comes to the second half, that still doesn't give you success.
It's a fascinating point, and I wonder, is that something that you realize in retrospect, or did you know that, you know, going into even Coursera in the first place?
I think when I went into Coursera, I was like a deer in the headlights. I had no idea what I was doing. I had never been at a company. Not only had I never built a company, I'd never been at a company. So it was kind of like jumping off a cliff and not even knowing where bottom was. I think there was a leap of faith that fortunately turned out to be true, that if we built something that had huge demand, then we'll figure out how to make it work. So in that case, as you said earlier, Jordan, there was this notion of we had customers already. Now, I think as we all recognize now, free customers and paying customers are two very different things. And so there's that wall that you need to hit, but I'm glad that we were able to find a way around that actually kept the spirit of the company of making the content freely accessible to everyone while still finding a way for having people who can afford to pay, have them pay. But yeah, I think that realization of you need to think about the end game, or at least if the answer is you don't know, maybe that's okay, but at least you need to know that that is a thing that you don't know and that you need to keep in mind.
So speaking of that, we have the question from Motwani, who says, how did you as a computer scientist have enough knowledge leverage in the biology domain? And I guess to take it a little bit further, as you said, when you started, you didn't really know the people in drug discovery.
Right.
How did you figure that whole other side of this, you know, the second half of what Insitro means? How did you figure that out? How did you figure out where to go, how to find the people, how to build the solutions?
So let me answer the first part first, which is how did I get into biology? And the answer is this wasn't a recent transition. So, I mean, just to make it clear, a lot of people in the computer science world view me as a computer scientist, and they don't realize I started doing biology back in, you know, like the late 90s when the first interesting data sets in biology were starting to come out. And I had no knowledge of biology. I went to a high school system that was very heavily tracked. So you were either math physics or you were biology chemistry, and I was math physics. And so I think I used to say that my last biology class was in middle school, but I think it might actually have been in elementary school. And so you kind of, if this is a thing that you want to learn a new space, biology or anything else, you just kind of have to go and do it. You jump in, you read papers, you read books, you ask really stupid questions. You're not embarrassed to ask stupid questions because you figure it's not that you're stupid, it's just that you come from a different space. You resign yourself to the fact that the first time you pick up a paper in this new discipline, I used to tell myself I understood every third word, and most of those were prepositions. So, and you just learn over time on the job, and it's scary, but it's fun at the same time to learn a whole new discipline in kind of like your adult years. Starting a company is actually more scary because the stakes are much higher and you feel like you got to keep executing. And at the same time, you're figuring it all out for the first time. I will say that this is a place where having the right investors does actually really help. I was fortunate enough to have a couple of my early investor groups who were able to connect me to people and help me with some of the early recruiting and so on. And so I think that was hugely valuable. And then hire people that you trust and then let them do their job, especially if they're outside your discipline, while at the same time, especially if you're the CEO, you don't want to just delegate and forget. You want to delegate and learn. And so ask questions, not because you are challenging their judgment, but so that you can understand better and partner with them better over time. So treading that line, threading that needle, if you will, between trust and delegate, and yet not just let things go to the point that you're a total ignoramus about the substance of your business, is really important. And I've seen people who go the other extreme, and they're like, even people who grew up within the biotech industry, it's like, oh, I came up through commercial, I don't understand the science. It's like, that is not the right approach. You really want to understand the science, even if it takes you longer.
That can be a hard thing, though, for someone who's got domain expertise and comes from a place where they've been very successful, right? Because they're showing sometimes to their employees that I don't know as much as you, and I have to ask what might be perceived as dumb questions, but I'm going to ask them anyway because I want to learn. I think part of that is building that into the culture of the organization, where there are no dumb questions. People can, everyone's got their area of expertise. You're all here for a reason. We need to learn from each other. Did you encounter that as you were building the company, where you had to basically kind of make that part of the culture?
So that's a great question. And I would say that actually there's a story around that. So the day before we had our first all hands, which was tiny because there were 5 of us at the beginning of the company, I realized that here we are, we're about to start a company tomorrow, and we didn't have a cultural North Star. I didn't want to lay out values by myself, because I felt like values should be something that you come up with your leaders, and I didn't have any leaders. But at the same time, I didn't want to just let the culture develop as it does. And so I wrote down a set of 5 behavioral principles that turned out to withstand the test of time quite well, and eventually, actually earlier this year, morphed into our values. And one of them, and it's the last one, not because it's the least important, but because they're ordered from what we do to how we do it. And the last one is we engage with each other openly, constructively, and with respect. And all of those words matter. Engagement means you don't silo. Open means open to both asking naive questions, but also receiving naive suggestions, even if it's from someone who's not an expert, because that orthogonal thinking is really incredibly valuable oftentimes. Constructively means that when you have those interactions and have those questions, it's in order to make the outcome better rather than to be the smartest person in the room. And respect means deep respect for the background and capabilities and experience that each person in the company brings to what we're trying to do. And that's at all functions, all roles, and all levels. And I think that is probably the single most pervasive value that we have as a company.
And did you end up writing these down so people?
We did. And as I said, we refined them this last year with what is now an amazing executive team that I have, with some input from others, and they're now placed it all over the walls at Insitro, and people use them in conversation, and they use them in performance assessments, and they use them when assessing candidates, which is exactly what values need to be.
So I think this is a really, really instructive and valuable piece of the discussion for new founders who are not, very often people coming out of a science-based background, whether it's as a computer scientist or someone coming out of biology or chemistry, aren't necessarily thinking about the cultural fabric of the company they're starting. And this cultural element can really be the differentiator in success.
Huge. So important. We're in a very fast-moving field here, and obviously the decisions that we make have consequence on the decisions on the technology stack and the science that we pursue. But things move, things change. The technology that was state of the art today is going to be obsolete in 6 months when the next GPT comes out or whatever. Not that impacts us that much, but the thing that stays and is very hard to change, for better or worse, is the culture and the people who imbue that culture. And so it's absolutely a critical thing for people to be thinking about.
And just to give a little more explanation of what that means, that culture, as you say, when technology changes, you can, be ahead of your competitors or behind you. Things go up and down almost on a, hour-to-hour basis in a startup. The greatest thing in the world happens at 10 a.m. and the worst thing in the world happens at 4. And then the next morning, the greatest thing in that world happens again. But to kind of ride through that up and down experience, that roller coaster experience, the culture can really set a it can provide a level playing field kind of across the organization. It builds loyalty among employees, and it really sets the condition under which you can succeed. It also, I think, in a lot of places defines, you can see the difference in culture in organizations. And you see this at some of the biggest tech companies in the world, very different cultures between Google and some of the others out there. But you see it really forming fairly early on in startups as well. How much did you, at the beginning of Coursera, and then particularly at Insitro, because you'd had the Coursera experience, how much did you concentrate on that at the very, very beginning?
A lot. And I would say Coursera, that was one of the things that, looking back, I wish I had done better. I remember an early conversation at Coursera with a senior candidate who asked me, as a co-founder or co-CEO, what would you like the culture to be? And I was sitting there, not literally, but kind of scratching my head saying, what is culture and why do you need it? You come to the office, you do your work, you go home, what's culture? And I think learned the hard way over time that if you're not deliberate about culture, it can very quickly go awry. And at Insitro, I was very deliberate about instilling those values, hiring, even though we didn't call them that, hiring to them, and then really also building systems and organizational design elements that aligned with that culture. So, for example, at Insitro, people report functionally. So a machine learning scientist reports to a machine learning leader so that they have the right professional development, can learn from that person. But all the project work is done in cross-functional teams that work together across disciplines so that we avoid the silos and we get the best of the thinking that people have by really creating together, which is, by the way, another one of our values, is create together. And that is so important, to not only think of these as things that are pasted up on the wall, but how do you hire? How do you reward? How do you promote? And then how do you build the organizational design to really allow these things to shine?
So maybe what we can do after our session is ask if you would share those cultural values that maybe we can share to this group. We run a Slack channel. I think it would be incredibly valuable to learn from your experience. That would be an amazing thing. So we will do that. Thank you. Some other questions we've got from the audience today. Aaron Margolis asks if you have tips for working with domain experts. So in your case, it's maybe people in biology. It could be people in chemistry. He says, or he or she is working on an optical design company with a co-founder who's an optical designer. How do you make a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts?
I think it comes down to some of those values that we talked about: the engage with respect, the create together. I think a lot of times, I'm going to paint with a broad brush, computational people, especially machine learning scientists, come in with I have the silver bullet. It's the silver bullet to end all problems. If you think something is hard, it's because you don't understand the power of machine learning. That is a bad attitude to go into a conversation with. A lot of problems are genuinely hard. And there's subtleties in there that you as an outsider almost certainly do not understand and appreciate. And so really coming in with respect and listen to people, not to say that you won't be able to come up with amazing solutions by the use of a technology that you understand, but without understanding what the problem is, you're just going to say, oh yeah, that's going to be easy. So it's really important that engaging with respect.
Thank you. A few more questions. Shweta asks, while building AI models in the biology domain, did you face situations where the models were unable to reach the desired accuracy? What did you do in such situations to move forward? Example, did you abandon the project, figure out risk mitigation strategies, change the scope of the problem, etc.?
Biology is the epitome of places where things don't work as you expect. These are living systems. They not only do they not do what you expect, they do different things. Is a little bit different, or the cells are a little bit more tired, have been passaged a few more times, or whatever. And so you end up with nasty surprises all along. I would say that one of the things that that I deeply believe in, and that has somewhat gone by the wayside in machine learning, is is really looking at your data to understand when things are not working, why they're not working, what are some of the confounders or aspects that are differentiating in performance between a scenario where things worked and a scenario where things didn't. Machine learning in some sense has become too easy relative to where it was when I was training or a junior faculty member, to the point that people don't need to think. They don't need to think about their data. They don't need to think about their methods. They just download the data, they push it into this or that ResNet or whatever. They try 100 different things in the cloud, and then they pick the one that works and they declare victory. And that's great if you're lucky and you have a tractable problem. But if your problem is gnarly and complicated, then really thinking about your model and thinking about your data and understanding the interplay between them is really important. And so maybe you'll be lucky and not face problems like that. But if you do, that need to actually think before you execute is really important.
I think there's probably no founders who have not had the challenges of having to think through and sort through problems. So I think it's very good advice. One last question. We have lots of them, so I'm sure we're not going to get to them all, but we will take the questions and maybe we'll send some through Daphne, and if she has time in future and it can answer by text, we'll put them back into the Slack channel. But one last question. Can you share your thoughts on the ethical considerations surrounding online education and AI? And what are the biggest challenges comparing past, present, future of AI, particularly in the context of higher education and democratization of access to quality education? This comes from Leah Raquel.
So I think this is a moment in time for online education in ways that have just not existed in the past. Some of you are familiar with Bloom's 2 Sigma principle. Bloom, exact date in the paper, but several decades ago, did a study that was basically tested the performance of students that were that had a standard classroom instruction experience in a class, and ones that had a personalized tutor. And the ones that had a personalized tutor were 2 standard deviations higher in performance than the ones that were in the standard classroom. So that's why it's called 2 Sigma, 2 standard deviation. For those of you who don't remember your multivariate probability distributions, 2 standard deviations in performance is based that your average student is now executing at the 95th percentile. So it's a very big difference in terms of the performance. We were never able to afford to give students an individualized tutor. And I think with generative AI, we will be in a world where that is possible, where you can have an agent that interacts with an individual student, learns their special capabilities, what they understand, what they don't understand, is able to let them follow their interest in ways that are, aligned with their curiosity, but maybe brings them back to the main topic when necessary. And I think that is an unbelievable human rights opportunity to create a learning experience that even the people who are who don't have the ability to go to Stanford or Princeton can benefit from. At Coursera, we were had this dilemma. We could either do real scale or we could do real quality. And that dilemma is not unique to Coursera. I mean, if you look at the experience of 10 Princeton students sitting in a seminar room, that is an unbelievable experience, but you can't scale that. So how do you create that balance? And I think AI actually gives us that opportunity.
Okay, so I'm gonna be selfish and take the very last question and just go over a little bit on time. So with Insitro, you're now over 5 years in. Are you, with the development of AI recently, this kind of explosion forward, ChatGPT in terms of both what can be done and how people view AI, are you, in parallel to that, you've been obviously doing lots of work for years now in the space, but in Insitro in particular, are you more bullish about the ability to cure and treat disease using machine learning than you were at the beginning? Or have you just found it to be exactly what you thought, or harder?
So I think it's a combination. I think that there are certainly I learned from this experience, having never built a lab-based company before. I realized just how hard things in biology really are. And so that ended up being people will tell you that everything in biology costs twice as much, it takes 3 times longer than you expect. So that was an interesting learning. But from the perspective of, does the science fundamentally work? Is it going to be truly transformative? Is it going to give us novel biological insights that can truly make a difference to patients? I'm way more optimistic than I was before because we've seen it working. So the answer is kind of on both sides. It's harder, but it's also more possible.
Yeah, so I think it's a very honest answer, which I think is great for this audience to hear, but it's optimistic. We should be, anyone who's thinking about going in and using this technology to treat people in healthcare, the opportunity is there. And as you said, you've experienced it, you're seeing it.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Great.
All right. Well, Daphne, thank you so much. You've been a fantastic guest. This has really been an amazing experience. I think for everyone who's considering going out and building a company, there's no better role model on earth than you, who has done it from academia to 2 completely different fields. The first of which is already a public company, and the second of which is doing things on a grand scale to help people's lives globally. So an amazing example that you've set for all of us. Thank you. And we'll turn it back over to Leah to just wrap up and let people know about what's going on the next couple of days.
I'm going to step off because I'm being kicked out of this room.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daphne. And thank you so much, Jordan. We really appreciate you coming in a last minute moment. Again, apologies that Siobhan cannot be with us. She's quite sick and we wish her well. So thank you so much, Jordan. It was a great conversation. A reminder, our hackathon is ongoing. You can sign up now. It'll actually start on October 30th. And there's close to $10,000 worth of cash prizes here. So I really encourage you to take the skills and the things you're learning here and practice building product in AI. So it's a fun way to just start getting some feedback on your ideas and your ability to build product. So a reminder, we have our practical labs this week. If you missed it in the beginning, just a reminder, both Wednesday and Thursday, we're going to have practical labs. This is with Radical's Velocity team. So these are folks who day in, day out are working with leading AI founders, people who are building companies right now with artificial intelligence, and they are deep experts in talent and brand. And then on Thursday, you go to market and finance. So that's direct access to our team and a really special way to start getting some of your questions answered, and a really special way to spend some time with the Radical folks. So don't miss out on that this week. And that's it. That's the wrap up. So next week we have Jan Stoika. Stay in the Slack channel. You'll get updates there, and you can always reach out to me if you have questions. Thanks again, everyone.